there are some moments in life that don't arrive with noise, headlines, or applause. They come quietly. They grow in the spaces between ordinary days, hidden behind simple conversations, shared smiles, and the kind of loyalty that asks for nothing in return. For a long time, I believed that some parts of life were meant to remain private, not because I was ashamed of them, but because the things that matter most often feel too valuable to place under a spotlight. Love was one of those things. But eventually, there comes a moment when silence no longer serves a purpose. A moment when gratitude becomes stronger than fear, when honesty becomes more important than privacy, and when the people who have supported you deserve to know the truth. Today, I want to share a story that isn't about fame, success, or achievement. It's about connection. It's about finding someone who brings peace to your life in a world that often feels chaotic. And it's about learning that real love doesn't need to be attained. Men shy nation to survive, but sometimes it deserves to be acknowledged. This is the story behind why I can't hide my wedding anymore, and why a quiet love has become impossible for the world to ignore. For most of my life, I've learned how to live with attention, not because I ever chased it, but because it became part of the landscape around me. When enough people know your name, they begin to form ideas about who you are. They imagine your routines, your thoughts, your relationships. They build stories from photographs, interviews, and brief moments seen from a distance. Sometimes those stories are close to the truth. Most of the time, they're only fragments. I've never felt comfortable treating every part of my life as something that belongs to the public. Some experiences are too important for that. Some things deserve room to breathe without commentary. Some relationships deserve a chance to become strong before they're examined from every angle. That's why, for a very long time, I chose silence. People often mistake silence for secrecy. They assume that if you're not sharing something, you must be hiding it. But there is a difference. Hiding comes from fear. Protecting comes from love. The truth is that I wasn't trying to create mystery. I wasn't trying to make anyone curious. I simply wanted to hold on to something that felt real. In a world where everything can become a headline in a matter of minutes, reality is precious. Genuine connection is precious. The ability to sit across from another human being and share a moment that belongs only to the two of you is precious. There was a time when I thought privacy was the only way to preserve that. When you spend years living in public view, you become aware of how quickly things can change. One photograph becomes a story. One story becomes a narrative. One narrative becomes a version of your life that people repeat as if they were there. Eventually, you learn to keep certain doors closed, not because you're ashamed, messy of what's behind them, but because you've seen what happens when strangers walk through rooms they were never invited into. So I became careful. I learned to appreciate ordinary moments, a quiet dinner, a walk without destination, long conversations about things that wouldn't interest anyone else. The kind of laughter that appears unexpectedly and leaves you smiling hours later. The comfort of sharing silence with someone and realizing that silence itself feels complete. Those moments don't look extraordinary from the outside. They're not dramatic. They're not designed to impress anyone. But I've discovered that the most meaningful parts of life rarely are. For a long time, I thought happiness would arrive through achievement. I thought fulfillment was connected to goals, milestones, accomplishments. And while those things can bring satisfaction, they don't necessarily bring peace. Peace is something different. Peace arrives when you stop measuring your life according to expectations. Messy and say, patience and begin experiencing it for what it actually is. Love taught me that. Not the kind of love people write about in headlines. Not the kind that's built on grand gestures or public declarations. I'm talking about the quieter version. The version that shows up every day. The version that remains when nobody is watching. The person I married changed my understanding of that. Not because she transformed me into someone new. Not because she solved every problem or erased every scar. Real love doesn't work that way. Real love doesn't replace your past. It helps you carry it. She never asked me to be different. She never demanded perfection. She never expected me to have all the answers. She simply showed up consistently. And sometimes consistency is the most beautiful gift one human being can offer another. We live in a culture that celebrates intensity. We're taught to look for fireworks, dramatic moments, overwhelming emotion. But the older I get, the more I appreciate ability. I appreciate kindness. I appreciate honesty. I appreciate the people who stay when staying isn't exciting. Anyone can stand beside you during the easy chapters. The real test comes during the difficult ones. The real test comes when life becomes uncertain. The real test comes when grief enters the room, when disappointment arrives uninvited, when plans collapse, when confidence disappears, when exhaustion takes over. That's where character reveals itself. That's where love reveals itself. And what I've learned is that genuine love isn't measured by what people say during celebrations. It's measured by what they do during ordinary days. It's measured by patience. It's measured by understanding. It's measured by presence. There were countless moments when she could have chosen a simpler path. Life with me wasn't always predictable. There were schedules that changed overnight, responsibilities that pulled me in different directions, periods of exhaustion, periods of reflection, times when I needed space to process things I couldn't easily explain. Yet she remained patient, not passive, not silent, patient. There's a difference. Patience isn't the absence of strength. It's evidence of strength. It takes strength to listen. It takes strength to understand. It takes strength to believe in someone during moments when they struggle to believe in themselves. And every day, I found myself becoming more grateful. Not because life became perfect, because it didn't. Life never becomes perfect. There are still challenges. There are still losses. There are still uncertainties. But gratitude changes the way you experience those things. Instead of focusing on what's missing, you begin recognizing what's present. Instead of counting disappointments, you begin counting blessings. Instead of asking why certain things happened, you start appreciating what remained despite them. I think that's one reason this relationship became so important to me. It reminded me that happiness isn't always loud. Sometimes happiness looks like two people drinking coffee in the morning before the rest of the world wakes up. Sometimes happiness is a conversation at the end of a long day. Sometimes happiness is knowing that no matter what happens outside your door, there's someone inside who understands your heart. For years, I protected those experiences. I protected them because they mattered. I protected them because they felt sacred. And honestly, I believed that was enough. I believed that keeping our relationship private would allow it to exist beyond expectations, beyond opinions, beyond speculation. But eventually something unexpected happened. The relationship became stronger than the privacy surrounding it. The truth became larger than the effort required to keep it hidden. Not hidden in a deceptive sense. Hidden in the sense that I rarely spoke about it, rarely acknowledged it, rarely invited others into that part of my life. At some point, I realized that silence was no longer serving the same purpose. The relationship wasn't fragile anymore. It wasn't something that needed protection from every outside influence. It had developed roots. It had weathered storms. It had survived difficult seasons. And because of that, I found myself looking at things differently. I started asking a simple question. If something brings genuine meaning to your life, why spend all your energy pretending it isn't there? Why act as though gratitude should remain invisible? Why treat joy as though it's something that needs permission to exist? The answer, I realized, was that it doesn't. There comes a moment when acknowledging love becomes an act of honesty. Not performance, not publicity, honesty. And honesty matters, especially in a world where authenticity often feels rare. People don't need another perfect story. They don't need another carefully crafted image. What they need is evidence that real connect. Ion still exists. That loyalty still exists. That commitment still exists. That two people can find each other, build something meaningful, and choose each other again and again through the passing years. That's what marriage means to me. Not a ceremony, not a photograph, not a ring. Those things are beautiful symbols, but they're not the foundation. The foundation is choice, the daily decision to care, the daily decision to listen, the daily decision to remain present, the daily decision to grow together instead of apart. And when I think about the journey that brought me here, what stands out most isn't a single moment. It's the accumulation of small moments, thousands of ordinary experiences creating something extraordinary. A life, a partnership, a home. Silence has a way of revealing what noise often conceals. When two people are surrounded by constant attention, opinions, and expectations, it becomes easy to mistake visibility for truth. But real love does not do. It depends on being seen. In fact, some of the most honest forms of love begin where the world is not looking. I learned that slowly, not through theory, but through experience. At first, silence felt like protection. It felt like a boundary I could control. If I didn't speak about something, then it couldn't be misinterpreted. It couldn't be reshaped into something it wasn't. It couldn't be taken apart by voices that were never part of its creation. So I kept things quiet, believing that distance from attention would preserve their purity. But silence does something else over time. It strips away performance. It removes the pressure to explain, to justify, to define every detail for an audience that was never part of the original story. And in that space, something unexpected happens. What remains is not emptiness, but clarity. In the absence of external noise, you begin to hear the smaller truths. The way someone listens without interrupting. The way they notice things you never pointed out. And the way their presence doesn't demand anything from you. yet still gives you something you didn't realize you needed. These things don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with dramatic significance. They accumulate quietly, like layers forming something stable over time. I used to think love needed expression to exist, that if something wasn't spoken about, it risked fading or becoming uncertain. But real love is not fragile in that way. It doesn't require constant validation to remain real. It grows in repetition, in reliability, in the unremarkable consistency of showing up, even when there is nothing to prove and no one watching. There were days when life felt too full of everything except stillness, meetings, obligations, travel, responsibilities that never seemed to pause. And yet, within that movement, there was always a point of return, a place where things slowed down, a space where conversation didn't need to accomplish anything, where silence between words didn't feel uncomfortable but natural, almost like a shared rhythm. That is where love began to feel different for me, not as an event, but as a condition, not as something you enter once, but something you learn to live inside. And the more I experienced that kind of connection, the more I understood why it had to be protected in its early form, not because it was weak, but because it was forming its identity, like something still learning how to stand. The outside world has a way of naming things too quickly, of assigning meaning before meaning has fully developed. Silence, in that sense, was not absence. It was incubation. But silence also teaches humility. It reminds you that not everything needs to be interpreted, explained, or shared to be valid. Some experiences are complete without translation. Some emotions exist fully without needing to be converted into language for others to understand. There is a quiet strength in that realization, because it removes the pressure of performance from love. It allows it to exist without audience, without commentary, without the need to defend its legitimacy. In that kind of environment, love becomes more honest. It stops trying to be impressive. It stops trying to meet imagined expectations. It becomes more focused on understanding than being understood, more focused on presence than explanation. I noticed that the most meaningful moments were rarely the ones that can be described easily. They were small, almost invisible from the outside, a glance that carried understanding without needing words, a shared silence that didn't feel empty, a moment of laughter that didn't require a reason. These are not things that translate well into stories, but they are the things that build something real between two people. And over time, I began to realize that silence was not keeping love hidden. It was allowing it to settle into something deeper than visibility, something less dependent on recognition, something that did not change shape depending on who was watching. Of course, silence is not always easy. It can create distance if misunderstood. It can appear as absence when it is actually presence in a different form. That is why it requires trust, not just in the other person, but in the relationship itself. Trust that what is real does not disappear simply because it is not constantly expressed outwardly. There is also a certain courage required to remain in silence while something important is growing, because silence does not offer reassurance in the way words do. It asks you to pay attention differently, to notice patterns instead of declarations, to understand intention rather than explanation. And perhaps that is why, when love grows in silence, it becomes harder to doubt, because it has been witnessed in its most unfiltered form, not curated, not presented, not adjusted for perception, just lived. I came to understand that love does not need constant visibility to be strong. It needs consistency. It needs care. It needs two people willing to remain present even when nothing extraordinary is happening. Especially then, the world often overlooks that kind of love because it doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't compete for space in crowded rooms. But its absence is what makes everything else feel less grounded. And its presence, though quiet, changes the way you move through life. In silence, love stops being something you perform and becomes something you inhabit. And once you experience that, you realize it was never about being seen at all. And there is a kind of fear that doesn't show itself in obvious ways. It doesn't always look like panic or hesitation. Sometimes it looks like control. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence held too tightly, as if saying less will somehow protect more. I lived inside that kind of fear for a long time without fully naming it. When something matters deeply to you, the instinct is to protect it. That instinct is not wrong. It comes from care. But protection can slowly shift into isolation if you're not careful. You begin to draw lines not just between your private life and the world, but between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. And without noticing it, you start to believe that keeping something safe means keeping it unseen. At first, it feels reasonable. If something is precious, you don't expose it to unnecessary pressure. You don't invite noise into something still forming its foundation. You don't open doors too widely when you are still Arning what exists inside the room. That kind of caution feels responsible, even wise, but fear is patient. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't force you. It simply adapts to your decisions and grows comfortable in the space you give it. Over time, I started to realize that what I thought was privacy was sometimes hesitation. Not hesitation about the relationship itself, but hesitation about what would happen if it became visible. What would people say? What would they assume? What would be misunderstood? How quickly something real could be turned into something distant from its original meaning. Those questions don't arrive all at once. They accumulate quietly. They sit at the edge of decisions. They influence what you choose to share and what you choose to hold back. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to live with two versions of the same truth, the lived experience and the carefully unspoken one. What I didn't understand at first was that fear of exposure can start to shape the way you experience even the most genuine moments. Instead of being fully present, a part of you begins observing from a distance, not because you don't trust the person you're with, but because you're unsure how the world will interpret what you already know to be real. That creates a quiet tension, a subtle division between what is felt and what is shown. And over time, that division can make something simple feel more complicated than it needs to be. I remember thinking that if I could just keep everything contained, nothing would be disturbed. If I didn't name it, it couldn't be distorted. If I didn't open it, it couldn't be misunderstood. That logic feels protective, but it also creates pressure, because anything meaningful eventually asks to be acknowledged in some form, even if only gently. Fear, when left unexamined, starts to define boundaries that feel like safety but function like limitation. It convinces you that distance is the same as protection, that invisibility is the same as stability, that what is unspoken is somehow safer than what is simply honest. But real connection does not grow in fear. It grows in presence, and presence requires a willingness to be seen, even imperfectly. There were moments when I noticed how fear changed the texture of experience. A moment that should have been simple began to feel filtered. A conversation that should have flowed naturally became slightly guarded, not because anything was wrong, but because part of me was always aware of what might happen if that moment became public property. That awareness is subtle, but it is powerful. It takes you out of the moment and places you slightly outside of it, as if you are both living and monitoring your own life at the same time. And that is where I began to understand something important. Fear does not always protect what you love. Sometimes it distances you from it. It creates the illusion of control while quietly reducing the fullness of experience. It makes you feel like, you are preserving something, when in reality you are restricting its natural expression. I don't say this as criticism of caution. Caution has its place. There are things in life that deserve careful handling. There are moments that need time before they are shared, but fear becomes limiting when it stops being a temporary response and becomes a permanent filter over everything you feel. What I learned is that the people who matter most do not need to be hidden in order to be valued. Their worth is not increased by secrecy, and their reality is not weakened by acknowledgement. In fact, sometimes acknowledgement is what allows something to settle into its true shape, to exist without distortion, to breathe without pressure, to be recognized for what it actually is, not what others imagine it might be. But that requires courage, not dramatic courage, not the kind that is visible from the outside, a quieter kind, the kind that simply allows truth to exist without constantly managing its perception. Letting go of fear doesn't mean exposing everything without thought. It means no longer letting imagined reactions decide the value of your reality. It means understanding that other people's interpretations are not stronger than your own experience. There is a moment in every life where you realize you have been holding something too tightly, not because it was fragile, but because you were afraid of what would happen if you loosened your grip. And in that moment, you also realize that what you were holding was never meant to be imprisoned by caution. It was meant to be lived. And living always carries the possibility of being seen. There is a difference between being seen and being understood, and for a long time I confused the two. Attention can be immediate, almost automatic, but understanding takes time. It requires patience, observation, and a willingness to stay present long enough for truth to reveal itself without being forced. In a world that moves quickly, that kind of patience is rare, and when it is absent, what replaces it is often noise. I used to think peace was something you arrived at after everything else was resolved, after the work was done, after the questions were answered, after the world stopped asking so much of you. But life doesn't work in that sequence. Peace doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It appears in the middle of uncertainty, if you allow it to. The challenge is that most of us are trained to look for validation outside ourselves. We measure stability by how things appear rather than how they feel. We assume that if life looks calm from the outside, that it must be calm within, but that is not always true. And more importantly, the reverse is also true. A life that appears simple or quiet may contain a depth of peace that cannot be measured by observation alone. I learned, slowly, that peace is not the absence of movement. It is the absence of resistance to movement. It is not about controlling every variable arrow in you. It is about learning how to remain steady even when you cannot. There were times when my life felt like it was defined by motion, constant transitions, constant expectations, constant adjustments, and in that movement, I began to realize that what I was actually searching for was not more control, but less internal friction. I wasn't trying to stop life from changing. I was trying to stop fighting the fact that it always does. Peace began to appear in unexpected places, not in achievements or milestones, but in ordinary moments that I previously overlooked. A quiet morning where nothing is required of you except presence. A conversation that doesn't need to lead anywhere. A shared space where silence is not uncomfortable but natural. These moments don't announce themselves as important. They feel almost too simple to matter, and yet they are often the most grounding experiences we have. What I came to understand is that peace is not something you construct. It is something you allow. It exists beneath the layers of expectation, beneath the pressure to perform, beneath the constant evaluation of whether things are going the way they should. When those layers soften, even slightly, something quieter becomes visible. I also realize that peace is deeply connected to acceptance. Not passive acceptance, but clear acceptance. The kind that acknowledges reality without immediately trying to reshape it. There is a subtle difference between improving your life and constantly resisting it. One comes from clarity. The other comes from discomfort with what already is. The more I observed this, the more I noticed how often tension is created internally rather than externally. Situations themselves are not always as heavy as the mind makes them. It is the interpretation, the anticipation, the imagined outcomes that create most of the weight. When those layers are quieted, even temporarily, the same situation can feel entirely different. In that sense, peace is not about changing your environment first. It is about changing your relationship to it. There is also something deeply grounding about realizing that not everything requires a response. Not every moment needs to be explained. Not every feeling needs to be resolved immediately. Some things simply need to be witnessed without interference. And in that witnessing they often settle on their own. I began to appreciate the value of stillness in a way I didn't before, not as inactivity but as clarity. Stillness allows you to notice what is actually present instead of what you assume is present. It gives space for things to reveal themselves without distortion. And in that space, peace becomes less of a pursuit and more of a recognition. There is a kind of peace that comes from external stability, but it is fragile. It depends on conditions staying the same. The kind of peace I began to understand is different. It remains even when conditions change. It does not require everything to be easy. It only requires that you stop treating difficulty as a disruption to your entire experience of life. And when I reflect on the presence of someone who has become part of my life, I see that this understanding of peace was not something I arrived at alone. It was something that was reflected back to me through consistency, through calm presence, through a way of being that did not demand constant explanation or justification. There is a quiet strength in people who do not try to overpower the moment they are in. They simply remain within it. That kind of presence changes the atmosphere around you. Not dramatically, but steadily. It makes space feel less like something to manage, and more like something to inhabit. It makes time feel less like something to race through and more like something to experience. And in that environment, peace stops being an abstract idea. It becomes something lived, something shared, something that does not require effort to prove its existence. What I have come to understand is that peace is not found in escaping life's complexity. It is found in no longer being overwhelmed by it. It is the ability to stay present even when things are unresolved, even when questions remain open, even when the future is uncertain. Because in the end, peace is not the absence of life's movement. It is the presence of clarity within it. Commitment is often spoken about as if it were a single decision, a moment where everything becomes fixed and certain. But the truth I have come to understand is that commitment is not a moment at all. It is a practice. It is something that is chosen repeatedly, in ways both visible and invisible, long after the initial decision has faded into memory. When people think of commitment, they often imagine permanence, something unchanging, something absolute. But real commitment is not built on the idea that nothing will change. It is built on the willingness to remain present even as everything does. That distinctio matters more than it might seem at first, because life is not static. People are not static. Circumstances evolve, emotions shift, understanding deepens or sometimes becomes more complicated. If commitment depended on everything staying the same, It would rarely survive its first encounter with reality. What makes commitment real is not certainty about the future, but willingness in the present. The willingness to listen again when you think you already understand. The willingness to stay when staying requires effort. The willingness to grow alongside another person instead of expecting them to remain exactly as they were when you first met them. I used to think strength in relationships was measured by intensity, by how strongly something is felt at the beginning. But intensity is not the same as endurance. Intensity burns bright, but it does not always last. Commitment, on the other hand, is quieter. It does not always announce itself. It is not always dramatic or visible, but it remains steady even when emotion becomes less loud. There are moments in every long-term connection where things are not easy to define. Moments where clarity is replaced by complexity, where understanding requires effort, where patience becomes more important than certainty. These are the moments that reveal what commitment actually is, because it is easy to remain present when everything feels aligned. It is easy to stay when the path is clear and uncomplicated. The real question is what happens when it is not. In those moments, commitment stops being an idea and becomes a choice, a conscious decision to remain engaged rather than withdraw, to continue showing up even when immediate reward is not visible, to trust that what has been built is worth more than the discomfort of temporary uncertainty. I have learned that commitment is deeply connected to responsibility, but not in a restrictive sense. It is not about obligation imposed from the outside. It is about recognition, Rico, Manyan, of the value of what has been shared, recognition of the significance of time invested, recognition of the fact that something meaningful deserves attention even when it is not easy. There is also a humility required in commitment, a willingness to accept that you will not always have the right words, that you will not always understand immediately, that you will sometimes need to pause, reflect, and return with more awareness than you had before. That humility creates space. Space for misunderstanding to be corrected. Space for growth to happen without pressure. Space for two people to remain human within something that is often idealized. One of the most important things I have realized is that commitment is not about eliminating distance. It is about knowing how to return from it. There will always be moments where people feel slightly out of sync, where perspectives differ, where silence carries more weight than conversation. These moments are not failures of connection, and they are part of its natural rhythm. What matters is not the existence of distance, but the willingness to bridge it, again and again. In that sense, commitment is not a refusal to change. It is a refusal to abandon care when change happens. It is the decision to remain engaged with someone's life even when it becomes more complex than expected, even when it requires more patience than anticipated, even when it asks you to reconsider your assumptions. I have also come to see that commitment is closely tied to attention, not constant attention, but meaningful attention, the kind that notices not just what is said, but what is unspoken, the kind that recognizes shifts in energy, changes in tone, moments of silence that carry meaning. This kind of attention is not passive, it is an active presence, and presence is the foundation of everything that lasts. There is a misconception that commitment restricts freedom, but I have found the opposite to be true. When commitment is real, it does not reduce freedom. It deepens it, because it removes the need to constantly question whether something will remain. It allows you to invest fully without holding back part of yourself in reserve. Without commitment, there is always hesitation in the background, a subtle withholding, a quiet uncertainty that prevents full participation in the moment. But when commitment is genuine, that hesitation begins to fade, and what replaces it is depth. Depth of conversation, depth of understanding, depth of shared experience. Commitment also teaches patience in a way nothing else does. Not passive waiting, but active endurance. The ability to remain engaged while things unfold at their own pace. The understanding that meaningful growth cannot be rushed, and that forcing clarity often destroys what time could have naturally revealed. Over time, I have learned that commitment is not proven in grand declarations. It is revealed in repetition, in consistency, in the small decisions that accumulate, laid into something larger than themselves. It is in choosing to listen when it would be easier to withdraw. It is in choosing to understand when misunderstanding would be simpler. It is in choosing to stay present when distraction would be more comfortable. And perhaps most importantly, it is in choosing the same person repeatedly, not because you have to, but because you continue to recognize their place in your life. When I think about the meaning of commitment now, I no longer see it as something that binds. I see it as something that stabilizes. It gives structure to change without resisting it. It allows two lives to move forward without losing connection. It creates a foundation that can hold complexity without collapsing under it. And in that foundation, something very simple remains at the center, the quiet decision to keep showing up. XO, Gratitude is often spoken about as something you express after the fact, after you have received something, after a moment has passed, after a situation has resolved itself into something understandable. But I have come to realize that real gratitude is not something that belongs only to reflection. It can exist in the present moment, even while life is still unfolding, even while things are uncertain, even while nothing feels fully complete. There is a quiet shift that happens when you begin to notice what is already present, instead of constantly focusing on what might be missing. It is not a dramatic change. It does not happen all at once. It is subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But over time it changes the way you experience everything. For a long time, I thought gratitude was reserved for the obvious things, achievements, milestones, moments that stood out clearly against the background of ordinary life. But I now understand that some of the most meaningful reasons for gratitude are not dramatic at all. They are found in the consistency of small things that often go unnoticed. A presence that does not demand attention, but offers it. A conversation that does not need to be impressive to be meaningful. A silence that does not feel empty, but shared. These are not things that typically get remembered in stories. They are not the moments that are photographed or spoken about in detail, but they are the moments that shape how a life feels from the inside. I have learned that gratitude begins to grow when you stop treating life as something that is always moving toward a destination, when you stop seeing each moment as a means to an end and begin recognizing it as something complete in itself, even if it is simple. There is something deeply grounding about recognizing that what you have right now is not just a transition towards something else. It is already part of your life. It already matters. It already carries meaning, even if that meaning is not futile. I didn't understand yet. In the past, I often focused on what was ahead, what needed to be done, what still needed to be resolved. And while there is nothing wrong with having direction, I have learned that constant focus on the future can quietly take you away from the present. It can make you overlook what is already stable, already supportive, already quietly sustaining you. Gratitude brings you back to that, not in a way that denies difficulty, but in a way that places difficulty in context. It reminds you that even while challenges exist, there are also things that remain steady, things that continue without needing recognition, things that are easy to overlook precisely because they do not ask to be noticed. One of the most powerful realizations I have had is that gratitude is not dependent on circumstances being perfect. In fact, it becomes more meaningful when they are not, because it is in imperfect moments that you begin to see what actually supports you, what remains when NGS are uncertain, what continues when other parts of life feel unstable. There is also a difference between appreciating something and taking it for granted. The difference is not always visible from the outside. Two people can live through the same experience, but one may carry awareness of its value, while the other lets it pass without reflection. Gratitude is what creates that awareness. It slows you down just enough to notice what is already working, already present, already offering support without needing acknowledgement. I have found that gratitude also changes the way you relate to people. It shifts your attention from what you expect to what you receive, from what is missing to what is given freely, from what could be better to what is already enough in its own way. And when you begin to see people through that lens, something important happens. You stop measuring them only by what they do for you in extraordinary moments, and start recognizing the value of how they exist in ordinary ones. The person who listens without interruption, the person who remains present without needing recognition, the person who brings a sense of calm simply by being there. These things are easy to overlook when you are focused on bigger ideas of success or progress, but they are often the foundation of emotional stability, the quiet structures that hold everything else together. Gratitude also teaches you something about time. It helps you understand that not everything needs to be rushed in order to be meaningful. That presence is not less valuable than progress. That stillness is not emptiness. That a moment does not have to lead somewhere to matter. In that sense, gratitude is closely connected to awareness. The more aware you become of what is already present, the less you feel the need to constantly search for something more in order to feel complete. This does not mean ambition disappears. It simply means that appreciation begins to exist alongside it, rather than being postponed until later. There is a quiet strength in people who do not overlook what they have while still hoping for what may come. That balance creates a different kind of stability, one that is not dependent on constant change. When I think about the relationship that has shaped much of this understanding, I do not think only of major moments. I think of continuity, of consistency, of the way someone can become part of your daily experience without needing to announce themselves. The way presence can become familiar without becoming ordinary. That kind of presence is not something that demands gratitude, it invites it, not through grand gestures but through steady existence. And over time, I have learned that gratitude is not just something you feel in response to receiving something significant. It is something you cultivate by paying attention to what is already quietly sustaining you. It is the recognition that even in a life that is still unfolding, there are already, may die reasons to be grounded, already reasons to be steady, already reasons to be grateful, not someday, but now. There comes a point in life where silence stops being enough, not because silence loses its value, but because truth grows beyond the space where it was once held. What begins as something carefully protected, something kept away from noise and interpretation, eventually becomes something that asks to be acknowledged simply because it exists so fully in your life. I used to believe that keeping something private meant keeping it safe, that if I didn't speak about it, define it, or place it under the weight of other people's opinions, it would remain untouched. In some ways, that is true in the beginning. Privacy can give a relationship room to breathe, room to grow without distortion, room to exist without being reshaped by outside expectations. But over time, I realized something important. Protection is not the same as denial, and silence, when it lasts too long, can start to feel less like care and more like distance from something that is already real. There is a difference between not needing attention and avoiding acknowledgement. One comes from peace, the other comes from fear, and at a certain point, I had to be honest with myself about which one I was living in. What I had been protecting was not something fragile anymore. It had already proven itself through time, through consistency, through the quiet strength of simply continuing to exist, despite everything life brought into its path. It had grown roots that were not dependent on being seen, but also not weakened by the idea of being seen. And that is when I began to understand that hiding something real does not preserve its purity. It only limits its expression. There is something deeply human about wanting to keep meaningful things close, to hold them gently, carefully, away from anything that might distort them. But life does not ask us to freeze what we love in place. It asks us to live with it, to allow it to exist fully, even when that means it becomes visible to others. Visibility does not have to mean exposure without boundaries. It does not have to mean losing privacy or surrendering something sacred to public interpretation. It simply means no longer pretending that what is real is not there. I began to see that honesty is not about revealing everything. It is about no longer denying what has already become part of your life. And when I think about the person I chose to share my life with, I think about the consistency that made this realization possible. Not perfection, not idealization, but consistency. The kind that does not rely on dramatic moments to prove itself, but reveals itself in the ordinary rhythm of daily life. There is a kind of strength in someone who does not ask to be made into a story, but simply continues to be present within it. That kind of presence does not demand attention. It earns recognition slowly, through time, through patience. Through the quiet accumulation of shared experience, and eventually, you reach a point where you understand that something so steady does not need to remain hidden to remain meaningful. I do not see acknowledgement as performance. I see it as alignment, a way of allowing the outside understanding to reflect what has already been true internally for a long time. Not to change it, not to amplify it, but to simply stop denying its existence. There is also a responsibility that comes with truth, not the responsibility to explain it to everyone, but the responsibility not to distort it through silence when silence no longer serves its original purpose. Because silence can protect, but it can also erase, and I never wanted what was real in my life to feel erased, even unintentionally, by my reluctance to speak about it. At the same time, I have learned that acknowledgement does not mean invitation to interference. Some things remain sacred even when they are no longer hidden. Some paragraphs of life remain untouched by outside opinions simply because their foundation is not built on approval, but on understanding between two people. That is what makes it stable, not secrecy, not exposure, but understanding. And when understanding is strong enough, it does not collapse under visibility. There is a kind of peace that comes from no longer dividing your life into what can be seen and what must remain hidden, but instead recognizing that what is meaningful does not change its nature based on who is aware of it. I have come to respect that balance more deeply than I used to. The balance between privacy and honesty, between protection and acknowledgement, between keeping something close and allowing it to exist openly without fear. Because in the end, what matters is not whether the world sees everything, but whether you are honest about what is already real within your own life. And when I think about why I can't hide my wedding anymore, it is not because something has, changed about the love itself. It is because I have changed in my understanding of what it means to honor it, not by making it louder, but by no longer pretending it is something it isn't. By allowing it to exist fully, quietly, honestly, without the weight of unnecessary concealment. And in that honesty there is a kind of freedom that silence alone could never provide.